Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. In this one we start out in the Pokrovsk section of the front line where the Russians have advanced further in the Hrodivka direction, both within the town where they've captured another block and in the south of it where they've captured a couple of forest lines. This has allowed the Russians to strengthen their flank east of Shirovka, and the Russians will likely push continuously through the town in a northern direction towards Krasny Yar, cutting the connection between Hrodivka and Novhrodivka as they continue fighting over Novhrodivka to the south and Hrodivka to the north. At the same time, the Russians, following the capture of Shelane, have now started attacking in the direction of Novoshelane, capturing their fortified positions to the north of the village and reaching the outskirts of it. To the east, they've managed to capture one of the fortified positions of the Ukrainians along the Vovcha river line. This has allowed the Russians to now have a road connecting Novoselivka-Persha to Shelane and strengthening the Russian positions in the east. This will allow the Russians to concentrate larger forces and push in the direction of the river line here on the western bank of it. The Russian offensive operation continues as I've expected, with their main push being in the direction of Hrodivka, Novhrodivka, and the fortified positions to the south in the direction of Seledovo, as well as to cover the area in between the western bank of the river line here by Shelane and down south to connect with Karolivka in the south, allowing the Russians to have an additional road towards Seledovo, where they'll continue pushing here south of Seledovo to gain control over the heights west of the Ukrainian agglomeration of towns and villages here to the east, which will allow the Russians to have a strategic advantageous position with fortified positions and high ground on their side against a set of Ukrainian villages located in the lowgrounds. In the Toretsk section of the front line, the Russians have managed to advance here west of Selishne in the direction of Nelipivka, where they have captured the southern parts of the electrical substation and a few of the fortified positions of the Ukrainians. This is a start of a Russian operation to connect the tips between New York here in the west towards Nelipivka and from Selishne in the east towards Nelipivka, where the objective is to connect both of these to gain control over the remains of the Ukrainian 2014 line of defense, which would lead to the Russians gaining control over 100% of it. There is still a small part here in between Krasnoarivka and Nevelske, however that could and could not be considered part of it. Regardless, it is in the open fields and it is far from areas of combat operations. The Russians could, with their operation in the north, completely bypass it and leading to it being completely insignificant. Therefore, it is likely that with the control over the northern parts here by New York, it can be considered that the entirety 2014 line of defense is under Russian hands. In the north here in the Pivnishne direction, the Russians have captured a further significant part of the town, and this has led to the Russians also capturing one of the heights in the second line of defense and most of the fortified positions, leaving only the height in the south remaining of the Ukrainian second line of defense in the Toretsk section of the front line. And this has now led to the Russians having such a strong position along the second line of defense that they can start storming the city of Toretsk itself. Most importantly, the apartment complex area in the eastern parts of it, and to advance towards the heights here in the center. The Russians also need to gain control over the heights in the southern parts of the second line of defense to be able to attack the southern parts of the city as well. We're likely going to be seeing a large-scale operation by the Russians here in the Toretsk section of the front line as soon as they gain full control over the second line of defense, as they'll start pushing towards the central parts of Toretsk. Toretsk itself is also located on the high ground. This position here in Toretsk overlooks the entire area here along the Kryvyi Turets river. The villages of Nelipivka, Petrivka and so on all located on the low grounds. Therefore, any Ukrainian positions within these villages would likely either withdraw to the fortified positions on the heights to the west, or move into Toretsk to strengthen the defenses there, leaving the entire area uninhabited, and the Russians would be focusing on gaining control over the fortified positions to the west, following the capture of New York, and to push within Toretsk itself. So we'll see a lot of fighting in both of these areas, and whoever comes out on top will gain control over the entirety of it. Moving on to the Kursk section of the front line, we see further developments, mainly here in the central parts where the Russians have managed to capture Toretsk, where they have managed to launch a counterattack here northwest of Martinovka and push along the river line. We see here that in this area, the Russians have been pushing the Ukrainian forces ever since the Ukrainians managed to gain a foothold and gain control over the flank. This has led to the Russians slowly operating to establish a front line and push the Ukrainians back. Their objective is to regain control over the line here by the railways. Gain control of that would allow them to restart operations to recapture Sutsha. The Ukrainians have pushed beyond the railway here in the northern parts and in the eastern parts. However, the Russians are now slowly counterattacking here in the north and in the center. They also need to continue operations in the south. However, currently the Ukrainians are on the offensive near Martinovka, where they're looking to gain control over the town. Very heavy fighting continues as the Ukrainians are developing the offensive operations further. Further north in the direction of Stefanovka, the Ukrainians have actually launched a GRG with this road that spans about 17 kilometers long, where they sent a delegation of Humvees and infantry towards Stefanovka, where they were ambushed by Russian forces. Stefanovka was likely not their target, but they were probably going further northwards. But a Russian ambush was waiting for them in Stefanovka, which managed to destroy the convoy. It is still unclear what the Ukrainian objective is. There's no indication that they are satisfied with what they've gained so far. With the current rate of offensive operations, they plan on going even further. However, they have been stalled over the past few days, where their offensive operations have not yielded that many results. Instead, we're seeing that the Russians are slowly establishing their front line and are getting closer and closer to completing doing that. However, the Ukrainians have not stopped it there. They are trying to do anything they can to improve their positions, and this has led to them operating in a wider front. They have previously attacked in the direction of the Belgorod region, where according to this article by the Washington Post, Ukraine offensive in Russia expands beyond Kursk region. Soldiers say they talked with a Ukrainian soldier only going by his call name, Hacker, and in this article he says that him and his unit went into an incursion in the Belgorod region, where his convoy managed to actually enter the region and, according to him, go 6 miles deep, which is about 10 kilometers deep, before they were ambushed and were hit with artillery, FPV drones, and everything else. And this led to the entire unit being wiped out, in the sense that every single soldier in his unit became a casualty and were forced to withdraw to the rear to get treatment for their wounds. So we see that the Ukrainians have not had near the amount of success in the Belgorod region as they've had in the Kursk region, and that is exactly what I predicted. This is due to the fact that the Ukrainians took advantage of a spot in the Russian Kursk defenses where there really was a gap in the defenses as the Russians were preparing their own. At the same time, the Russian soldiers were simply not ready for the attack. They were not active. They were not rapidly responding to it. This led to the Ukrainians having a lot of success on the first day, and having a lot of success on the first day leads to a good momentum that allows you to have success on the coming days and the following days. And the more you can take advantage of that, the more the offensive spirals out of control for the defenders. Instead, now that the Ukrainians have entered the Kursk region, the other regions will not be ready. They will all be prepared for a Ukrainian strike. And this has, at the same time as there's really no gaps in the Russian defenses, now that they have entered the only place where there was a gap, the Ukrainians are facing off against a well-fortified position where the enemy is expecting them. Therefore, the Ukrainians are in a position where they really do not have nearly the same situation as they had in the Kursk region, and it becoming that much more difficult is pretty much reminiscent of the Ukrainian summer offensive, where they'll just drive up to Russian positions and get hammered by their explosives and then fall back due to the heavy fire. At the same time, the Ukrainians are also trying to develop it further the northern parts of the Kursk region, where they have managed to hit the bridge by Zvanoe here in the northwest, and managed to hit the bridge in Glushkovo here in the northeast. So based on this, we see that the Ukrainians may be looking to launch an offensive operation south of the same river, which goes here from the western parts through the north of Zvanoe and Glushkovo all the way to the Koronevo direction. This could be an operation by the Ukrainians to flank their fortified areas from the east and push them from the south, opening or widening up the front in the direction of Titkino and other areas. However, the Russians are prepared for this operation, so we will see how fast they are able to respond to the bridges being blown. It was reportedly blown by a HIMARS rocket launcher. And this brings me to another point, and that is the longer the Ukrainian Kursk offensive goes on for, the more difficult it becomes for the Ukrainians. We see that the Ukrainians in this offensive has made use of a lot of air defense, deploying both old system like the S-125 near the border area, which is a static system, and although old, it will also be effective really against anything. The thing about old system is that the guidance is not that good and the range is not that good, but in large quantities it can still be useful. However, the Russians did detect this and managed to destroy it, and similarly with this IRIS-T system as well, where the Russians have managed to detect it and strike it. The longer time goes, the more air defense is going to be vulnerable in this section of the front line, and the Russians are going to hit them one by one. More interesting developments, such as the Russians detecting this Su-24 in its airfield and striking it, destroying it. There's also additional footage, which is a very, very interesting development, and that is that the Russians found 4 separate Patriot batteries in the Dnipro region, where they managed to hit all of those with a cluster munition strike one by one into different strikes into different areas in the Dnipro region. Although the damage is unclear and likely not that significant, considering it is cluster munitions and there were no direct strikes, there is still the fragments which could hit them and send them to repairs, and hitting 4 in such a short time in the same area could create a significant gap in Ukraine's air defense, and that would be very difficult for the Ukrainians to plug that gap quickly, and this could lead to Russian operations. But what Russian operations with the air force there is in the Dnipro section of the front line, I'm not really sure. Therefore, although significant systems were hit, the effects would likely just be limited, no significant changes. Therefore, that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon for additional content. Thank you all for watching, and have a great day.